Hello, church. Welcome to our online worship service for Sunday, November the 15th. Now, as you may already have figured out, we are not live this morning. As we work to ensure that we are following the current public health orders, we have decided to record our service ahead just to make sure that we have the right number of people involved. Now, in the spirit of a children's show that I used to watch many years ago, I want to remind you that we are still all together. And if I look really close, I can see the Giesbrecks, and I can see the Jansens, I can see the Klippensteins, and I even see a Harapiak lying on his recliner drinking coffee as he watches the service. That will probably be me, actually. I just want to remind you that we are a family in Christ. In fact, in this peculiar time that we're facing, I want to assure you that the Church of Jesus Christ is alive and well, just as Jesus, our Savior, is alive and working in our world. With that said, our community life continues as a church family, just in different and sometimes unique ways. Our youth and young adult ministries continue online via Zoom, and I'm also recording daily 1-minute devotionals every weekday for our youth, and they are posted on our Instagram and website. Our women's Bible study, we're looking at completing that via Zoom, and we're just working on plans for that. And we also have weekly children's programming. These are lessons that are recorded and posted on our website for every Sunday morning. Now, as the snow starts to fall, you're probably wondering what's happening with Christmas. And while our children's Christmas program will look different this year, we are excited about the opportunity we have to try something new. We're going to be compiling video clips into a Christmas program that will be made available on December the 20th. So while we may not be meeting in person, we can still enjoy all the wonderful elements that come together to make a program like this so special to everyone. We would love to have as many children as possible volunteer to act out and then film parts for the Christmas story that will be part of this program. You can even get the rest of your family involved if you want. We will provide the lines and even the costumes. If your children are interested, please contact Kathy Rempel early this week and let her know. We believe this video will be a huge blessing to our church family. Many look forward to our children's program, and this is a unique and fun way to share the message of Jesus with all. Now, as we move into a time of worship, I invite you in your homes to join and sing along with some songs that our worship teams recorded this summer. May God bless you and guide you in the week ahead.
God, I'm on my knees again. God, I'm begging, please again. I need you. Oh, I need you. Walking on these desert roads, water for my thirsty soul. I need you. Oh, I need you. Your forgiveness is like sweet, sweet honey on my lips, like the sound of a symphony to my ears. the splendor of the King, clothed in majesty, let all the earth rejoice, all the earth rejoice. He wraps himself in light, and darkness tries to hide, and trembles at his voice, and trembles at his voice. How great is our God? Sing with me, how great is our God, and all will see how great is our God. The splendor of the King, clothed in majesty, let all the earth rejoice, all the earth rejoice. He wraps himself in light, and darkness tries to hide, and trembles at his voice, and trembles at his voice. How great is our God? Sing with me, how great is our God, and all will see how great is our God. Name above all names, you are worthy of all praise. My heart will sing, how great is our God. Name above all names, you are worthy of all praise. My heart will sing, how great is our God. How great is our God? Sing with me, how great is our God, and all will sing how great is our God. How great is our God? Sing with me, how great is our God, and all will see how great is our God.
Hello, church. It's good to be with you again after 3 weeks of not preaching. How many days is it till Christmas? Well, if you're watching this on Sunday, it's 40 days until Christmas. I'm looking forward to Christmas, as I'm sure that we all are. Now, some people have complained in the past that I haven't done enough Christmas series, and so this year I thought I would do 2 of them, one right after another one. And this first one is called The Great Silence, from Babylon to Bethlehem. It's really a story of how the pages of Scripture end with the book of Esther, and then suddenly you turn the page over, and the next story, the next time the Scriptures come alive, we have an angel revealing himself to Zechariah and to Mary, announcing that Jesus would be born. So this is really a series of that silent period of time between when the story of the Old Testament ends and the New Testament begins. It's a story about a period of time that we don't really know that much about. Now, I got a question for you. How far is it from Babylon to Bethlehem? Well, if you measure it on a map, it's about 1,200 kilometers to get from one to the other. To put it in perspective, that's like going from Winnipeg to just past Brooks, Alberta, which is just outside of Calgary. Or if you go the other direction, it would take you to Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. It takes the average person about 235 days to walk from Babylon all the way to Bethlehem. But in biblical time, how much time is it between Babylon and Bethlehem? Well, it's about 500 years. Now, I know when you look at the Bible and you consider all of the time that it spans from the book of Genesis, which really chases the story of humanity all the way from the Stone Age through the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age and all the way up to the beginnings of what we know as antiquity, 500 years sounds like a really short period of time. Not a significant time at all. But I want you to think for a moment how long 500 years is. Or in fact, let's shorten it a little bit and let's just take the time from the closing pages or the closing verses of Esther to the moment in which the angel appeared and announced the birth of Jesus to his mother, and at best, it's 430 years. You might think, well, that's nothing in ancient history. But I want you to page back and think back 430 years in our time. 430 years ago. I mean, 430 years ago, Galileo was still a young man, and the vast majority of the people on the earth thought that the earth was at the center of the universe and the sun revolved around the earth. Galileo hadn't even looked out at a telescope and seen the planets around Jupiter, and now, 430 years later, we've already landed a spacecraft on one of the moons of Jupiter that he was able to see through his telescope. 430 years ago. I mean, that's just barely after Menno Simons died. I mean, think about it. Farmer sausage and Zwieback had just barely been invented 430 years ago. The world is completely different from 430 years ago for us. And the Bible, too, when you end at the book of Esther, it's a story full of satraps and Persians and it speaks of a time that's so unfamiliar to us, but then you turn just the Bible over a few pages and suddenly you find that Jesus enters a completely different world. Suddenly we're introduced to figures like Caesar Augustus and Emperor Tiberius, later on Pilate. We're introduced into a world where there's this thing called Roman laws, and Jewish people speak Greek, and they read from Greek scriptures. When did any of that happen? In the time of Jesus, we're introduced to people called Pharisees and Sadducees and Zealots, and they're fighting against some Roman soldiers. What in the world happened to produce a world that ended with Esther just outside of Babylon? And then suddenly we find ourselves in Bethlehem. Now, most biblical scholars refer to this time from when the Hebrew scriptures end, about 430 years before the birth of Christ, and of course, when the New Testament revelation starts, as the 430 silent years, or the Great Silence. Now, that doesn't mean that God was not at work. Oh, he was very much at work. That doesn't mean that there weren't faithful followers of God during that time. There were. That doesn't mean that God still didn't do miracles. He did. And that doesn't mean that God didn't still reveal himself to prophets and to people. He did all of those things. I think of Simeon, the man who met Jesus and blessed him when he was a little child, because he had received a word from the Lord that he would not die before he would be able to see the Messiah. All of that went on. No, God still spoke. In fact, in the book of Habakkuk, chapter 1, Habakkuk is complaining to God. And by the way, this is just before Babylon And he's saying to God, God, what are you doing? And God says to him, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. God was at work just before Babylon, and he was going to need to do a whole bunch of things on the world scene to prepare the world for the coming of Christ. Things were going to change technologically. Things were going to change philosophically. Things were going to change politically and economically. And he needed to prepare the hearts of his people to receive the Lord. And if he explained it all to us, we wouldn't even believe it. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, well, now wait a minute. If the Bible doesn't talk about these 430 silent years, maybe we don't need to know them. Maybe they're not important. Maybe we don't need to know about how we got from here to there. And I would say two things to that. First, I would say that in the Scriptures, context, history, dates, times, places, witnesses, evidence matter, because the story of God is about God revealing himself and saving people in history, in time. And so the Bible is full of information about what was going on at the local times. And so these things are very, very important to God, and they should be important to us. Unless we understand some of these things when we open up the book of Matthew or the book of Luke or the book of John and we start to introduce ourselves to Jesus, some of those things we simply won't understand unless we know something about the in-between years. But there's another reason that period of time is important, and that is because actually God did reveal in his holy word what happened in those 430 years. The only thing is he didn't reveal it during the time it was happening. He didn't reveal it after it had happened in a retelling. He actually revealed it before it was going to happen. And so today I just want to look at a prophetic word from the book of Daniel, and I just want to unpack what this prophetic word meant in history and how it shaped the world, how we got from Babylon to Bethlehem, and how the world was a completely different place when Esther lived than when Jesus was born. So we're going to open up the book of Daniel, and you can find it in the book of Daniel, chapter 2. It's a pretty well-known story. Maybe you've heard of it. King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he calls on all of his people to interpret the dream. Now, he's a smart man, and he realizes this dream is significant. It's not like a usual dream. It's some kind of a revelation, some kind of a supernatural revelation. And he's afraid that his wise people, his magicians, his astrologers, are just going to make up an interpretation. And so he doesn't tell them the content of the dream and tells them to interpret it for him. And they say, we cannot do this. Finally, Daniel is called upon as one of these people to go upon the dream, and Daniel realizes that he can't interpret it either. And he goes to his friends, and he says to his friends, please pray with me. And this is what it says in chapter 2, verse 17. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azaziah, and he urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision, and then Daniel praised the God of heaven. And he said this, and this is important. Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes the times and the seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning, and he reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells in him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. And so Daniel has not only the content of the dream, he has its interpretation. And the content of this dream actually came from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, from our God, from the God that we worship. And this is very important. And so the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, says to him, okay, so tell me my dream. And this is what Daniel tells him. He says this is the dream. He's replaying the dream. As your majesty, this is verse 29, as your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come. And the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. Now, as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than anyone who is alive, but so that your majesty may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind. Your majesty looked, and before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock cut out, but not by human... we'll just stop there. Its legs of iron and its feet partly baked of clay. Now, a little bit later on, he interprets this part of the dream to him. And he says this in verse 36, "This is the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. Your majesty, you are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory in all your hands. He has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are that head of gold." And remember, this is Nebuchadnezzar. This is the man who just a few years before had gone in and destroyed God's temple in Jerusalem, razed it completely to the ground. He had completely taken brick by brick, stone by stone, ripped down the walls of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was completely leveled. And then he violently, the people he didn't kill, he took them to Babylon into exile. Of course, this is something that the prophets had been warning for a long time, specifically and generally was going to come. But Nebuchadnezzar was the man through which God would exercise his discipline upon his people. He was, however, a ruthless, brutal dictator, and his kingdom was one of might and power and strength, and he ruled with an iron fist, and he demanded that everybody conform to his vision, to his religion, to his way of thinking. He was a very powerful and scary man. And it says here, of course, that God put him in that position, and that is true. God appoints kings and rulers and presidents, the ones we like and the ones we don't, the ones who do good and the ones who do evil. Nebuchadnezzar is still accountable for God for every one of his evil actions, but make no mistake, God was at work. Now it says here, after you, this is verse 39, another kingdom will arise inferior to yours. So he says Nebuchadnezzar was the head, and then below that is the chest. And this next kingdom to come after Nebuchadnezzar was, of course, the Persian Empire. Now, the Persian Empire would, in some senses, be larger than even Nebuchadnezzar's empire, but it would be a weaker kingdom. The Persians would not rule with an iron fist the same way that Nebuchadnezzar did. They generally let the nations they conquered keep their religion, sometimes even keep their kings and keep their rituals. And so in that sense here, Daniel is saying it will be a weaker kingdom. Daniel actually would still be in Babylon long after Nebuchadnezzar had died and one of his sons was on the throne. And by now he would be an old man, and the new king, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, was having a huge party. And you remember the story, the writing on the wall, and Daniel was again called to interpret the dream. And on that very night, and this is recorded in the secular history books as well, the king of Persia, Cyrus, came in and he had his generals dam off the river that flowed through the city of Babylon, and his soldiers went right under the dry bed that was created under the walls and basically took over Babylon. And that was the end of the Babylonian Empire on that very night. Now here is the beginning of the 430 silent years. Here's what we know. That King Cyrus, who took over Babylon, this next empire that would take over, he was actually quite kind to the Jewish people. And he allowed some of them, a very small number of them, to head back to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple that was completely destroyed. And you can read about this in the scripture. It was a terrible, sad time, and some rejoicing because they now had a temple again, but some weeping because the older people who had been alive and had seen the old temple, it was just a small, little mini temple compared to what they had. And then a little bit later, Nehemiah came and rebuilt the walls of the city. But that's about all that we know. After Queen Esther and her story, we lose track of the Israelites for about 100 years, and it's lost to history during the Persian Empire. But it was during the Persian Empire that God used Cyrus the Great to bring the people back home after the 70 years of exile was over. Verse 39, the second part says this: "Next, a third kingdom of bronze will rule over the whole earth." The Persian kingdom ruled for about 120 or so years. And that's the point at which we lose track of really what was going on in Israel. But when we pick up the story again, this kingdom that he's talking about here refers to a person by the name of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was from Macedonia. His father was a king of a local region, and he himself was tutored by none other than Aristotle. When he was 22 years old, him and his generals perfected a new way of fighting that the world had never seen. They invented these super long sword-like devices called phalanxes, and those things would protrude out, and no army could stand against this new technique. And he basically mowed through the known world at that time. From between the ages of 22 and 32, he conquered northern Africa, he conquered Turkey, he conquered the Middle East, he conquered all the way up into the lower parts of Asia, and all the way up into India. And historians tell us that in some ways, depending how you measure it, this was perhaps the greatest empire the world had ever seen. For a brief moment in time, Alexander the Great himself ruled 40% of the world's population. This is very, very, very important because this shaped the future of Israel and really in many ways is responsible for creating the world that Jesus grew up in. It was during this time that the Jewish people were scattered all over the place. They were deposed, and very few of them were actually able to remain in Jerusalem. It was during this time that the Greek language became the language of basically the entire ancient world. It was everybody's second language, to the point where there were more Greek-speaking Hebrew people than Hebrew-speaking Hebrew people. It was during this time that the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, and the Bible that all of the early Christians used, the Bible that Jesus would have quoted, was not a Hebrew Bible, but rather a Greek translation of that Bible. It was from Alexander the Great learning and his philosophy that philosophy spread over the whole world, and modern ideas like democracy and everything spread. And it was a fascinating time of world transformation. The world really went from a regional kind of warring tribes kind of a place to suddenly a worldwide empire of learning. And the Jewish people adapted wherever they were. But here's the thing. Alexander the Great, smart and clever as he was, he died suddenly at age 32 after having conquered much of the known world. He had 4 generals, and he didn't set things up. He wasn't really expecting to die. And The four of them sort of carved up his empire, and two of them sort of got obliterated pretty quick, but there was two empires that are very, very important for the Israelite people, and they were based on two of his generals who took over. One was Seleucid, and the other one was Ptolemy. Ptolemy took over Egypt. Seleucid took over sort of Turkey and everything north of Israel, and they were fighting it out all the time, and the people living in the land were always caught in the middle of this. Now, there was one Seleucid king who, about 160 years before Jesus was born, had had enough with these pesky Jewish people living in Jerusalem. He was so frustrated that they continued to worship their God, that they continued to worship in the temple. He wanted everybody to worship the Greek gods. He wanted everybody to worship the greatest of the Greek gods, Zeus. And so finally, he marched into Jerusalem. He walked straight into the temple, followed with all of his troops, and he walked into the Holy of Holies, and there he set up an altar to Zeus, and he slaughtered a pig right on the altar of the Holy of Holies. Daniel talks about this too, the abomination that causes desolation. He had a prophetic vision of this moment in history. This was a mistake, at least if you're looking at things from the perspective of this general named Antiochus, because it made the Jewish people so angry. And there was one particular family with the name Maccabeus. Perhaps you've heard of the book of Maccabees or the Maccabean Revolution. This is what happened. And they were able to rally the Jewish people, and they were able to fight off Antiochus and the entire Seleucid army. And for approximately 100 years, Israel was able to carve out their land, and they were an independent country, and the borders of their country were bigger and stronger than even the empire when Solomon was king, long before, when everyone thought Israel was at its height. It was an impressive thing. Now, maybe you've heard this story, but that first few days when they chased the Greek Seleucid army away and were able to cleanse the temple because it had been defiled by the slaughtering of the pig and the altar of Zeus in the middle of it, the Jewish priests and religious leaders, they did a purification ceremony, which by the laws and traditions that they understood was supposed to take 7 days, but they only had enough oil in the lamps for 1 day. And during that dedication ceremony, the story is told that the oil that was only good for 1 day, and they couldn't find it anymore, miraculously lasted exactly as long as was required for the purification ceremony. Now you and I, we now understand that that date is called Hanukkah. Jesus, in one of the clearest passages where he reveals himself to be the Son of God, in John chapter 10, verse 22, it says that he went to the purification ceremony. Now, if you don't know any of this history, you wouldn't even know what that is, because that's mentioned nowhere in the Bible, but that happened during this time. That was Jesus basically celebrating the Jewish feast and the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah, where they dedicated the temple. But again, this would not last. This was a political kingdom. It was a kingdom forged with sword and with violence, and it started a chain of corrupt kings and corrupt high priests. King Herod was one of these descendants of this Maccabean family. It was not really a shining moment of pure Judaism, and it wouldn't last. In about 63 BC, now we're just 60 years from when Jesus was born, a Roman general by the name of Pompey marched into Jerusalem, and again he walked into the Holy of Holies and looked around and said to himself, "This doesn't look so bad. We'll leave the Jewish people alone as long as they submit to Roman authority." And from that moment on, Israel became a Roman colony. A few years before Jesus was born, a young Roman man by the name of Cyrus Augustus, at the age of 19, upon the sudden assassination of Caesar, through political machinations and through clever stabbing people in the back and every means that he could, over the next period between the ages of 19 and 31, he became the supreme ruler of Rome. Rome moved from being a democracy to being a dictatorship under an emperor. His name became Caesar Augustus. And ultimately, he is the one that issued the census that God used to bring Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem when they needed to be there. Well, that's a lot of history of things that happened. And by the way, this is predicted as well in Daniel's prophecy here. In verse 40, he says, "Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things into pieces, so too it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that feet and toes were partly baked of clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom, and yet will have some of the strength of iron in it. Even as you saw iron mixed with clay, and toes were partly of iron and partly of clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle." And this describes the people and the Roman Empire perfectly. Secular scholars have often marveled at this prophecy. How could he know? Well, it was supernatural revelation. Rome changed the world. Rome opened the doors. Rome united Northern Africa, the Middle East, parts of Asia, and most of Europe into one gigantic world empire with roads and with streets and with a common currency and with law and order. And it was a technological marvel. It was an incredible place. And that is the world that Jesus was born into. Now, what can we learn from all of these things? Well, first of all, God is in charge. God is in charge. Not only did he know these things would happen, Daniel says that he raises up kings and brings them down. I think the next important lesson that we can learn is don't get too attached to Nebuchadnezzar. Don't get too attached to Cyrus's. Don't get too attached to Alexander the Great's. Don't get too attached to Antiochus's or Caesar Augustus's. Don't get too attached, because kingdoms come and kingdoms go. Worldly things rise and worldly things fall. We just went through an election in the United States, and some people are elated and some people are deflated. As followers of Jesus Christ, don't let those things trouble you. You know, it's interesting. Alexander the Great was 32 when he conquered the world. Caesar Augustus was 31 when he established complete, absolute power over the greatest empire the world would ever see. One that would really last 1,000 years, depending on how you measure it. He was 31. And yet there came another king who at 33 surpassed them all. In fact, that was the part of the dream that we didn't read, because Nebuchadnezzar had one more part to his dream. He said this: "While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue of the feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer, and wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. And this is what Daniel says the meaning of that image was. In that time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor it will be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end. But it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. We know the story that we go from Babylon to Bethlehem, and Jesus goes from Bethlehem to the cross. If you had a time machine and saw one of the greatest generals the world had ever seen just before he died, or you compared him to Caesar Augustus, one of the cleverest, shrewdest, lethal, devious people who maintained absolute power over the Roman Empire just before he died, and compared him with a 33-year-old man hanging, crucified, and humiliated on a cross, which one would you have bet on? And yet, that Christ would use the Roman roads, the Greek language, and precise philosophical terms to describe the wonders of that cross, and the gospel would go out. And within a few hundred years, people who followed in Augustus's footsteps, emperors, would bend the knee and worship Christ and declare him as Lord. There's one more dream that, or several more dreams that Daniel had, more visions, but there's a special one in chapter 12, and I just want to end with these words. The dream that he talked about in chapter 2, or the dream that he revealed and interpreted, all happened exactly as outlined. And this is a dream that is actually talking about something that is yet to come. And in a day and an age where, boy, the world seems like it's coming apart at the seams, may you find comfort in these words. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress, such as not has happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people and everyone whose name is found written in the book will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, and others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, who lead many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, roll up the seal of the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. Let's find hope in the rock cut from the stone, but not with human hands. The kingdom that will last forever. The crucified King who rose again in troubled times. May you go in peace and have an amazing week. God bless.